Brian Barsky. I'm a professor of computer science and vision science, but in this case I teach in the freshman seminar program, and a couple of years ago I started teaching a class that I call Photographing History in the Making, and it seems relevant to what we're talking about here. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I think most people look at photography who are not photographers, and it's a window into the world, and they're seeing the content, and they'll talk a lot about the content, and they'll say, oh, that's a terrible photograph because maybe the subject matter is disturbing. But actually it's a great photograph, and in fact the more disturbing that the photographer is making that to the viewer, probably the better the photograph is. So I'm probably tending to be a little bit different because, well, of course the content is very significant to me, the whole UC thing, and I've been on the faculty for 3 decades now, so it's very important to me to think about our university. But a lot of what I'm looking at is the photographic aspect. Few people know that one of Ansel Adams' contributions to photography, the craft, was not just his body of work, but it was a technique called the zone system. And the zone system was critically important to be able to render these different tones on the image. One of the challenges in photography, this is still true today, but it was even probably more so then, is that if you have very varying lighting conditions in the same image, some areas are much brighter than others, then that's a challenge to render all these tones, because the lens ultimately, in most technology, is giving you one single exposure. I wanted to emphasize this photograph because it's interesting in the sense that you have the frames, just an arch. I mean, it's part of the building, it's part of the image, but it has so little light on it that it's rendered in black. This region through here is a very dark gray, and then there's some other grays, and you get through this region over here and it's very light, but not exactly white. In fact, if it were pure white, we wouldn't notice that there are little lines, vertical lines, that are still visible here. So if you expose correctly for the darker areas, then the lighter areas get bleached out, get too white, too hot. These are all the terms that photographers use, meaning that you would get just white and you wouldn't see any detail. And on the contrary, if you took an exposure for the white, brighter areas, then the dark areas lose their tonality. So he has been very careful to make sure that there's tones in the gray area and the white area. I don't know this building, but it's probably the case that the actual material is exactly the same color, and the different tones as a result of some shadow that's being cast by the sun. We see pictures like this, we usually assume that it probably wasn't white and then dark over here, that this is due to the difference in the sun. So he had to do some very careful work to ensure that he still got detail. This wasn't purely white and that wasn't purely black. And I think, again, this is a great example of not only his kind of work, but something he contributed to in the photographic craft, and that's why I really want to point that out, aside from the content and everything else that's there. Look at those beautiful clouds, and that's what, in some sense, is making this photograph. In fact, I think it is what's making this photograph. It's this tremendous contrast of the light and the dark here. It has so much punch, it stands out so much. In fact, I'd almost say down here is almost a detraction. I don't want to be critical of the great Ansel Adams, but this is kind of gray and not a lot of punch and not a lot of tone, but it's this cloud that just comes out. There were filters that would bring out the clouds and darken the sky, and this looks very characteristic of this to me. These filters could be used because these were black and white photographs. The filters are certain colors, so this would be a filter that would be a dark yellow, orange, and in some extreme cases actually red, which meant that they were filtering out certain wavelengths and allowing other ones to pass. Now if we were shooting a color photograph, we would completely distort the color. But in black and white photography, you can do that, and indeed they did. It has the appearance of having used these dramatic filters, that in concert with darkroom technique. In other words, if you were out that day, the sky didn't look that wild to you. There wasn't an eclipse going on. This is very dramatic. And that's what's making this photograph. And it is manipulation in a positive sense. He has probably used a filter over his lens to bring out the clouds, and probably he's also done some dodging and burning in the darkroom to bring that out. One of the things I try to impart in my students, the difference between a serious photographer and just a novice, is that a serious photographer does what we sometimes call pre-visualization, which is to say we think about ahead of time what we want to do, and then we take the steps to achieve that result. These aren't accidents. He was being very careful in the way he he implemented this.